With flagship season 2015 just around the corner with MWC, we're revisiting the Nexus 6 to see where it lands in the Android flagship space. But what better battle to wage right now than against the main competitor to Android itself? It's Josh Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And this is the Nexus 6 versus the iPhone 6 Plus. The so-called sixth iteration of both of these phones centered around one basic premise: going big. The iPhone 6 brought a rounded look to its design language, but in the larger Plus edition, the screen was bumped up to 5.5 inches. The result is an attractive phone of Apple's typical design cues, made a little bit harder to handle because of its size. Typical buttons include the volume rocker on the left side with the silence toggle, and the power button has been brought to the right side from the top for better access. A lone tactile home button up front also includes a fingerprint scanner underneath, and it lies somewhat concave to the front panel, and 2.5D glass adds to the more rounded look. A metallic construction automatically ups the phone's attraction, with lines denoting where the separations are in the parts. And of course, the Apple logo on the back is under the camera optics in the top corner. The Nexus 6, on the other hand, blew itself up to rather mixed reactions, mostly because of its handling. Motorola's design language took center stage here, as the phone looks like a large Moto X, except the backings are always made of plastic with the Nexus 6. No buttons on the front mean that the inputs are made with soft keys, and a curve on the back does help with the phone's feel in the hand. The camera optics are up top on the back of this white edition, with the now iconic Motorola dimple underneath and the Nexus logo in landscape under that. A metallic frame also helps the Nexus 6, adding to what is one of the most exquisite Nexus devices yet. The main story in the design department is handling, because aesthetic remains an opinionated matter. The iPhone is thinner and its rounded sides make it a little bit more comfortable to grip, but the larger bezels of the iPhone make it similar in size to the Nexus 6 nonetheless. Thickness makes the Nexus 6 a little harder to handle in one hand, though its curve does what it can to help. You're always going to perform hand gymnastics to go from side to side or to reach the top, but in the end, both of these phones manage to be really easy on the eyes, despite not always being easy in the hand. Large displays are par for the course here, as the trend continues to pick up steam. But in the case of the Nexus 6, you get a little bit more power in its display that might make you choose it over the Apple phone. That being said, Apple's display technology gets a bump up to 5.5 inches and a full HD resolution rocking 401 pixels per inch. What I always notice about iPhone screens, however, is that their color output is just a little bit more subdued compared to, say, the AMOLED displays of common Android flagships. And that's exactly what the Nexus 6 sports: an AMOLED screen at just under 6 inches. The big story with the Nexus 6 is its super high resolution. Going beyond Full HD, Google and Motorola decided to meet the trend of Quad HD with a display that is 2560 by 1440, sporting 493 pixels per inch. The result is a display that is outputting some intense power, and for work and play, you will be able to read sharp text and enjoy any media in a large fashion. There may have been some issues with burn-in reported, but on my particular unit, it hasn't been an issue at all. The colors on the iPhone 6 Plus are not bad at all, but they just seem to pop out a little bit more on the Nexus 6. This can be owed to the highly colorful motif of Android Lollipop, though. Nonetheless, we have an evolution in both of these devices, surely a welcome change for any veterans in either camp. But if you want a higher resolution to eke out that much more enjoyment from your smartphone usage, the larger and more powerful screen of the Nexus 6 is the obvious choice. Performance on a Versus like this is always a bit of an odd situation, because we're talking about two completely different architectures. The Nexus 6 sports the usual type of processing package created by Qualcomm, and in the Snapdragon 805, it enjoys the kind of high-level performance that you'd expect. Multitasking is an easy affair with 3GB of RAM, and I could run just about any application without any slowdowns. And while I may have seen a few hiccups and transitions here and there, it has more to do with the occasional bugs in Lollipop that are sure to be fixed in updated versions. And nonetheless, gaming is still a breeze with the Adreno 420. Apple likes to put together their own processing packages, and any iOS user can tell you that their architecture works well for their needs. The A8 is the processor of choice for this iPhone, and its dual-core 1.4 GHz Cyclone chip is backed by quad-core graphics in the PowerVR GX 6450. iOS has gradually become more about flashiness in its interface, but all in all, the simplicity of the operating system can still be felt. Moving along applications is pretty seamless, and even if 1GB of RAM is available, you're still able to keep a good number of apps running simultaneously. Gaming is also a standard affair, with games moving along well without much incident. Comparing Android and iOS is already tough on its own, but obviously there are a lot of users on both sides that report very good experiences. iOS runs really well on Apple's architecture on the iPhone 6 Plus, and even though Lollipop could use just a little bit more polish, it still runs really great on the Nexus 6. Hardware offerings on either of these phones take on mostly the typical fare, with the iPhone 6 Plus boasting one specific edition over the Nexus 6. Yes, the fingerprint reader on the iPhone is a press version, meaning that you can easily unlock the phone by pressing the home button to wake it, and then you can just leave your finger there. Aside from that, however, you get mostly the standard bells and whistles with various connectivity options and even NFC this time, though it is rather restricted to Apple Pay for the time being. The bottom-mounted speaker performs as expected with a pretty good soundstage and few thrills after that. A 2,915 mAh battery powers the 6 Plus, bringing a fair amount of battery life, though with enough power usage it will struggle to get past the one-day mark. Previous versions of the iPhone did have, famously, problems with longevity, and the larger and higher resolution screen on this edition does bring down the bigger battery to size a bit. On the Nexus 6, however, the lack of a fingerprint reader is helped by its media consumption features. The main enhancement on the Nexus 6 is right on the front, the dual front-facing speakers, whose placement simply trumped the bottom-mounted unit on the iPhone 6 Plus. And as far as connectivity goes, the Nexus 6 is the first of the line to get access across the board, with a version on Sprint and then one possibly coming to Verizon very soon. In battery life, the Nexus 6 actually suffers from the same issues as the iPhone 6 Plus. A much larger display and a big bump in resolution bring the 3220 mAh unit battery to size, making this phone get close to the day-and-a-half mark but never really getting past it. Unless you really want a fingerprint scanner on the iPhone 6 Plus, the front-facing speakers on the Nexus 6 are a compelling notch in its belt, especially when you consider that gorgeous screen for media consumption. The camera situation in this Versus is influenced by the device's ecosystem histories. While the iPhone has a pedigree of good performing cameras, the Nexus line has been, well, a bit uneven. The app on the iPhone 6 Plus is about as simple as you can get. Swiping on the viewfinder changes the various modes, and the different options for your pictures are accessed via buttons on the side. You get modes for regular photos, for video, for slow-mo video, and even a square interface that makes Instagramming easy. Panorama and time-lapse modes are also available for anyone that wants to get fancy with their smartphone photography. Now compare that to the Nexus 6, whose interface in the now Google camera has gotten simpler over time. Swiping from the left side of the viewfinder brings up the photo and video modes but adds photosphere and lens blur, the latter of which is more useful due to its stylish defocusing. Accessing HDR Plus is done in the small button on the opposite corner, which also allows for switching to the front-facing camera and adding a few elements to the viewfinder. Picture quality here, perhaps more so than in any other comparison between Android and iOS, shows that the evolution in either system has gone in the right direction. I'm quite familiar already with the good quality of the iPhone cameras, so the way that the pictures turned out were not much of a surprise. The Nexus 6, on the other hand, has really stepped up its game with pictures that have a higher color saturation and good detail in the 13-megapixel photos. The metering at times was a little bit different in both devices. In the cases when the Nexus 6 would get a good exposure, the iPhone would underexpose, and vice versa. But where the iPhone does get a step ahead is in its low light performance. The details were simply better captured in it than the grainier results of the Nexus 6. HDR modes on both of these cameras are at their best when used in the right situations. And while the iPhone opts to have an HDR auto mode to take out the guesswork, the Nexus 6 requires you to put a little bit of thought into your shots to activate the mode. Video modes also fall under a similarly even scope because both cameras now benefit from optical image stabilization. The Nexus 6, however, can record in 4K resolution, putting it over the full HD capabilities of what is already a pretty good performer in the iPhone's camera. If this were last year's competition, the iPhone 5S would have trumped the Nexus 5, and you know what? It did. But this year we have a more even playing field because Google and Motorola have stepped up their game in the Nexus 6. Even though the iPhone 6 Plus gets a little bit further ahead with its low light performance, the Nexus 6 is really not all that far behind, and that's saying something. And now the age-old question of Android versus iOS. Truth be told, if this was a comparison being made a couple years ago, there would be a far gap between the two ecosystems, but now, not so much. iOS was a pioneer in app development, getting many now essential applications far before Android did. But now Android has matured, and even with a few niche holes here and there, the difference has become mostly negligible. In the newest version of the operating system, iOS has been able to bring a number of features that Android pioneered, like the notification dropdown, a quick settings panel called Control Center, and a holo-like design that has refreshed the iOS look quite well. However, functionally, iOS remains about the same. No app drawer means organization requires folders, and despite the additions of the notification dropdown and control center, much of what veteran Apple users call home remains as such. That being said, there are still few limits on what you can do on iOS, and choosing is purely based on how you feel about its aesthetic. Android, on the other hand, has become rather ubiquitous outside of the Apple space, and its limits are just as far and few between now. The newest version of Android, Lollipop, brought with it a much starker aesthetic change, taking what already worked before and finding ways of presenting them in even better fashion. Google Now is now a launcher that comes with a second home screen for quick news and contextual cues from your Google history, and the notification dropdown has been made easier on the eyes, hiding an equally attractive quick settings panel. The only real hole I've ever seen with the Lollipop changes is in the recent app screen. It's like a nice Rolodex style way of looking through your apps, but putting all of the Chrome tabs there makes it a little bit unwieldy. Thankfully, you can turn this function off in Chrome to clean things up a bit. So despite a few bugs here and there with this earlier version of Lollipop, it is still a step forward for Android, whose forward movement over the last number of years has been readily apparent. Are you actually going to find many applications that work on one over the other? I bet not. So, choosing between these two depends on which interface you want to look at in order to access the ecosystem that you support. The iPhone 6 Plus and the Nexus 6 are the premium editions of their respective lines and come with price tags that fit that notion. The iPhone 6 Plus can be found on all networks for the premium price for smartphone plans, or the full unlocked price of around $800 in just the base 16GB edition. The Nexus 6, on the other hand, can be found on most of the networks for plans, or comes with the unlocked price of $649, putting it in a more affordable space for those who don't want tethers to their cellular plans. And so, there you have it. The Nexus 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. The best that both of these lines have to offer in their own big ways. Those who are already loyal to their ecosystems will make their obvious choices here, but for everyone else, the matter comes down to what you want out of your phone. Media consumption with front-facing speakers and a gorgeously powerful screen make the Nexus 6 a pretty compelling choice, but the iPhone 6 Plus has a pretty tried-and-true design language that has been thrust into the now of smartphone trends. No matter which one of these you choose, it really matters how you want to be presented, what you're going to use on your daily. As always, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this versus pitting the Nexus 6 versus the iPhone 6 Plus. These are definitely the best phones that both of these lines have to offer, and in the case of the iPhone 6 Plus, you get the Apple design that a lot of people love, along with a camera that's still a tiny cut above that of the Android iteration. But the Nexus 6 is the pure Android experience with a gorgeous screen and front-facing speakers to boot for your media consumption. Nonetheless, we have a great year ahead of us, and the Nexus 6 will be pitted against the other flagships that are coming out in the coming months. With MWC happening in just a couple weeks, we have a lot of comparisons to go through. So keep it tuned to Android Authority for all of that best coverage. Drop us some likes on our videos and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And then when you're done with all of that, head on over to AndroidAuthority.com because we are your source for all things Android.